Hey guys, I'm Bo Liddell with Images by Bolim. Welcome to part one of my introduction to focus stacking tutorial series. If you're serious about your photography, you've no doubt experienced circumstances like this where you simply couldn't attain the combined high sharpness of detail and extreme depth of field you were hoping to capture. Sure, there are some processing tricks that can help improve the appearance of detail and depth, but that has major limitations. And you can never truly get back fullness of depth or sharpness that was lost during capture because you might have made a mistake, or perhaps the nature of the scene and your vision for the shot made it physically impossible to achieve the extreme depth you wanted due to limitations in the gear that was used. This is where focus stacking technique has been a huge advancement for photographers. But before I present the technique in part two of this video series, it's important to have a good background on a few things. In this video, I'll present a short review of depth of field and sharpness. If you're already familiar with these concepts, you can skip to part two in this series where I'll describe focus stacking in more detail and why it can be a handy technique to have in your photography bag of tricks. Depth of field, one of the most important elements in photography, hereafter synonymous with depth, is the distance between the nearest and farthest objects in a scene that appear to be in focus. The best way to think about depth is that it's a zone, range, or field of perceived focus, and not the focal plane as it is sometimes referred to. Now that we have that out of the way, there are a number of factors that affect depth. Prior to the advent of digital photography, there were only three factors that affected the depth of field in our photos. But with the digital medium, a fourth factor impacting depth was introduced, namely the size or angle of view of the camera sensor. All things being equal, smaller sensors which have a higher density of photo sites, a narrower angle of view, and lower circle of confusion limit achieve greater depth than larger sensors. To illustrate, the next two slides were presented in my blog and video review of the image quality of the Canon EOS 7D Mark II, where I made comparisons with the full-frame 5D Mark III. If you look closely at these fit-to-screen comparisons from my image catalog, there is a better depth achieved by the crop sensor on the left compared to the full-frame sensor on the right. It's particularly easy to see the better depth when zoomed in at 100% to key parts of the subject. For those who might want a more objective, quantitative assessment of this factor, we can also use an automated depth of field calculator such as the True Depth of Field Pro calculator for iOS devices, which I like since it also accounts for the effects of diffraction, another important concept I'll talk about later. Before I continue, I'll explain what you're looking at. The focal length being used is noted in the lower left quadrant of each of these screenshots and marked with the small gray triangle. There are readouts of the amount of depth in feet and inches in front of and behind the focus point, as well as the total depth of field shown in the upper left quadrant. The aperture setting with the blue line is the right column of digits with the widest aperture shown at the bottom and smallest at the top. And the center column of digits shows the range in feet from 1 foot to infinity, with the blue line indicating the focus point and the red lines corresponding to the near and far limits of depth of field. As shown here on the right screenshot, the depth achieved at a focus distance of 10 feet and using a focal length of 80 millimeters on the full frame sensor is about 2 feet. Keeping the focus distance constant and shown on the left screenshot, an equivalent magnification and framing of the subject occurs on an APS-C size crop sensor at a focal length of 50 millimeters, resulting in a depth of about 2¾ feet. This represents nearly 40% wider depth of field than the full frame sensor. The difference in depth of field might not be tremendous, but nevertheless, using a crop sensor might be a consideration in certain instances where I need maximum depth, especially if I also want to use an optimal aperture setting for image quality that I'll talk about later. While the effect of sensor size might have implications in some circumstances, other factors including the lens focal length, focus distance, and aperture setting have far greater impacts on depth. The physical magnification of the lens has an obvious effect on the depth we can achieve. Simply put, as you can see illustrated here, for any given aperture and focus point, f8 and 12 feet in this case, as I increase the optical magnification from wide-angle focal lengths through short telephoto focal lengths, the depth decreases, and vice versa. So let's put some numbers to this. If I start out at a focal length of 28 millimeters on a full frame 35 millimeter sensor, using the aperture and focus settings just mentioned, the resulting depth as shown here covers a distance of a little over 1,400 feet. As I increase the focal length to 35 millimeters, I've reduced the depth by about 98% to only 25 feet. I've reduced the depth another 77% to 8 feet as I increase the focal length to 50 millimeters. And if I double the magnification from 50 to 100 millimeters, I reduce the depth by yet another 78% to just under 2 feet. So magnification clearly has a great effect on depth. But we can further tweak the depth by changing the next factor that I'll discuss. Similar to magnification, the focus distance, also known as the focus point, which may or may not be on the subject itself, has an equally important effect on depth. For any given magnification, aperture combination, 70 millimeters and f/16 in this case, the closer the focus point is to the camera, the shallower the depth will be. Likewise, the farther away the focus point is from the camera, the greater the depth will be until at some threshold the far limit of our depth will reach infinity. Overall depth is maximized at this focus point threshold, which is known as the hyperfocal distance or hyperfocal point. It's the closest distance we can focus on and achieve infinite depth. And I refer to this as complete depth for the settings and magnification used. Focusing beyond or in front of the hyperfocal distance will affect depth, but the impact is relatively minor if focusing behind the hyperfocal distance. In fact, as I increase the focus distance from the hyperfocal point to infinity as shown here, the depth of field near limit will eventually equal but never exceed the hyperfocal distance. Yes, overall depth has been reduced and is no longer complete since the out of focus zone in the foreground has expanded some, but it hasn't been a terribly large reduction in depth. In practice, I take advantage of this all the time when shooting landscapes without much near foreground subject matter. On the other hand, depth is affected much more and decreases very quickly as I focus on points that are in front of the hyperfocal distance. In fact, as I approach the minimum focus distance of a lens, which is well in front of the hyperfocal point, the depth of field becomes so shallow that it rarely exceeds a few inches. It even approaches zero in some circumstances, and in the process creates an out of focus zone in the background in addition to the out of focus zone in the foreground. It can be difficult to precisely locate the hyperfocal distance on your lens's distance scale. Many times we don't need to be that precise, but in general, if you need to maintain wide depth throughout to infinity and have to err one way or another, focusing past the hyperfocal distance is much more forgiving than focusing in front of it. The final factor influencing depth that I'll talk about, and the one that's probably the best understood, is the lens aperture setting. Simply put, for any given magnification and focus distance, increasing the aperture size, which is the same as decreasing the aperture number, will reduce the depth, and decreasing the aperture size, which is the same as increasing the aperture number, will increase the depth. At the lens's widest aperture, the depth is quite thin, with smooth, blurry foregrounds and backgrounds, even allowing you to literally shoot through some obstructions such as vegetation, as I've done here with the image on the left. This smooth blurred effect is known as bokeh or bokeh, depending on your pronunciation. Of course, the situation is reversed when using very small apertures, such as f8 or higher, where depth can become extreme, revealing rich texture and detail throughout much, if not all, of the photo. Now that we know what depth is and factors influence it, we're better positioned to achieve our photographic vision for a scene. But whether the detail that's contained within the near and far limits of depth actually appears sharp in our photos will depend on aspects affecting sharpness that we'll discuss next. For purposes of this video, I'll define sharpness as the relative clarity or resolution of edge detail that is in focus at the time of capture. Unlike depth, which is influenced by relatively few factors, a great many things as shown here influence sharpness. You may even come up with a few more that I haven't listed here. Most of these are pretty obvious, and we learn quickly how to mitigate their impacts. For example, we can choose lenses that generate the least distortion and aberration, refrain from using lens filters that soften detail, keep our optics clean, take steps to reduce or eliminate vibration and camera movement, and so forth. But one of the most important and easiest things we can do to maximize image sharpness, and the one that's, you know, I really find most people overlook, is to use an optimal aperture setting. Every lens has what's called its sweet spot where image quality is maximized. In the next couple of slides, I'll show parts of the scene delineated here, making comparisons among several photos taken with the same lens at equivalent exposures, but using different aperture settings to illustrate the effects of geometric distortions, chromatic aberrations, and diffraction on image quality, and how it also depends on the location within the frame. You can do something similar under controlled conditions to determine what aperture is optimal for the lens or lenses and focal lengths that you use. Near the center of the frame for this lens, you can see that all apertures are not equal. In this case, at a focal length of 33 millimeters, f6.3 is the aperture at which the lens performs optimally with best sharpness, contrast, and color saturation. Thus, for the center of the frame at 33 millimeters, this lens is limited most by diffraction when using pinhole apertures, resulting in noticeably softer image detail and relatively poor contrast and saturation. The effect of diffraction gets progressively worse as we continue to decrease aperture size beyond the threshold where scattered light rays dominate the light passing through the aperture, and I find is usually unacceptable beyond f11 in the digital age. If maximum sharpness is one of my goals, I generally try to shoot my lenses at their sweet spot, or no smaller than f8. If we move to the edge of the frame, using the exact same images, we see that this portion of the field of view with this lens is more limited at wide apertures by the effects of distortion and chromatic aberrations than by diffraction when using pinhole apertures. Still, we see the best quality occurring when setting the lens aperture to f6.3. The negative effect of lens aberrations and distortions when using wide apertures is more variable, whereas the negative effect of diffraction using pinhole apertures is pretty consistent across the frame for any given aperture. Also, the problems associated with using wide apertures become even more noticeable when shooting high contrast scenes and are also worse when using wide angle lenses. Finally, while higher quality lenses usually perform better when shooting with wide apertures, even the best glass in the world is diffraction limited when using small apertures. So the take-home message here is that there's an optimal aperture or very small aperture range for which any given lens um, performs best from an image quality standpoint, and it's usually near the center of the aperture range. If you have experience with film, you might recall that using apertures smaller than f11 was a standard practice when shooting landscapes. Although diffraction was also an issue when shooting film, we weren't as limited by diffraction until reaching f16, and we could get acceptable results in some cases at f22. So why are things so different with digital? That can be explained in part by the higher resolution of digital imagery compared to film, and the relative tendency that we have to pixel peep by viewing the image at 100% on a computer, such as shown here. But there's more to the explanation. In this slide, you can see I've lost a fair amount of sharpness, contrast, and saturation in the photo on the right taken at f20 compared to the image on the left taken at f11. And I could argue that the image on the left is already showing signs of being limited by diffraction. Each photosite on a digital sensor is in effect a type of lens, and just as small apertures create diffraction in an optical lens, they also cause diffraction across the sensor's photosites, thus compounding the problem. Now that we're mindful of the effects of diffraction on image quality, if we want to capture a scene in one shot, we have to consider the trade-off between image sharpness and depth of field. We must prioritize sharper detail with optimal, meaning slightly wider apertures, and thereby sacrifice some depth. Or we must sacrifice sharpness in favor of greater depth. The decision depends on your priorities, goals, and vision for a shot, of course. But in closing, wouldn't it be great if there were instances where we didn't need to worry about this trade-off, where we could have our creative cake and eat it too? This is where focus stacking technique comes into play to create sharply detailed images with extreme depth of field. If interested in exploring how focus stacking can expand your photographic creativity, keep an eye out for part 2 in this video series. Thanks for watching, and I hope you'll find something useful in this tutorial. If you have any questions about what I covered, feel free to send me an email at imagesbybolin@charter.net. You can add a comment below this video, or you can visit my website at imagesbybolin.com and click on the contacts link. Happy shooting, everyone.